What if burial rituals weren't just for the dead, but a way to help the living confront their greatest fear, death? For centuries, humans have struggled with the inevitable end of life, and across cultures, elaborate burial rituals have emerged to deal with this universal fear. These customs were not merely about honouring the deceased, they were an attempt to understand, control and confront death itself. Ancient civilizations from Egypt to Greece to the Americas created fascinating and complex burial practices that reflect how deeply death was feared, yet also revered. But what does it truly mean to fear death? Is it the finality that terrifies us, or the unknown journey we must all face? Throughout history, humans have devised intricate ceremonies to deal with this anxiety, whether by offering treasures, performing rituals, or constructing monumental tombs to ensure peace in the afterlife. These burial practices were believed to ensure that the dead would be properly cared for in their journey, but they also served another purpose, to reassure the living that death could be conquered in some way, even if only symbolically. Imagine stepping into the grand tombs of Egypt, where pharaohs were buried with unimaginable riches, servants, and food for their journey into the afterlife. Picture the ancient Greeks, whose funeral rites included elaborate rituals designed to honour the soul's transition from this world to the next. Or think of the Vikings, who sent their warriors off in ships, ready to sail into the afterlife, carrying their weapons and treasures with them. These were not just acts of respect for the deceased. They were rituals that dealt directly with the fear of death, the fear of what comes after, and the fear of losing loved ones. They were ways of facing a reality that no one can escape, mortality. The question that arises is, what can these ancient burial customs teach us about how they viewed death? How did they reconcile themselves with the unknown? And what can we learn from these practices today? This journey into ancient burial rituals is more than an exploration of cultural customs. It is a window into the deepest parts of the human psyche. It is a chance to understand how ancient civilizations faced the unthinkable, how they confronted death itself through their rituals, and how these practices were not only for the dead, but also a way to comfort the living. What did the ancient Egyptians, the Mayans, the Greeks and the Vikings fear most when they buried their dead? Was it the idea of never seeing them again, or the fear of being left to face death alone? Join me as we unravel the history of these hauntingly beautiful rituals and discover how they reveal the universal fear of death that has gripped humanity throughout the ages. In the end, we will see how these practices, though ancient, are still relevant to our own understanding of death today. Death is one of the most profound and universal fears that unites humanity. From the moment we become conscious of our existence, we're also aware that one day it will all end. For as long as we've walked the earth, humans have grappled with this inevitable reality, creating stories, myths, and rituals to try to make sense of it. Across cultures and throughout time, death has been viewed not only as a natural part of life, but as something deeply terrifying, a mystery that remains beyond our full comprehension. The fear of death is not simply about the loss of life. It is about the uncertainty of what happens afterward, the unknown void that awaits us all. For many, death represents a finality, an ending that offers no further answers, no possibilities for continuation. Ancient civilizations, in particular, were deeply invested in rituals that attempted to address this fear, offering ways to prepare for, confront, and even prevent death. From the Egyptian pharaohs to the Viking warriors, these cultures built elaborate burial rituals designed not just for the dead, but for the living as well. These practices were their way of confronting the fear of mortality head-on, a method of preparing the soul for the journey into the unknown. And in doing so, these rituals served as comfort for the living, providing a structure in which they could channel their anxiety and uncertainty. This collective fear of death didn't only inspire grand tombs and offerings, it shaped the way civilization saw life itself. For the ancient Egyptians, death wasn't the end, but rather a transition to an afterlife that required preparation. The belief in life after death drove them to create one of the most elaborate burial practices in history. Pharaohs, for example, were entombed with their possessions, their pets, and sometimes even their servants, as they were believed to need these things for the journey ahead. The mummification process, along with the creation of the pyramids, was a direct response to the fear of death, as it was believed to preserve the body for the afterlife and protect the soul from malevolent forces. Similarly, the Celts had their own practices to address the fear of the afterlife. The idea of an otherworld, a realm that one could access through proper ritual, was central to their burial rites. Weapons, food, and other items were placed in the burial sites to ensure that the deceased had everything needed for the journey to the next life. For the Greeks, death was seen as a crossing of boundaries, and their burial rituals were designed to ensure that the deceased could make this transition with ease, avoiding the wrath of gods or spirits along the way. In a similar vein, the Vikings buried their warriors with their ships, weapons, and treasures, readying them for their next great adventure in the afterlife. Whether through mummification, ship burials, or elaborate offerings, these rituals share one thing in common. They were born out of humanity's fear of death. Yet, they also served as acts of reverence, acknowledging that death was not something to be avoided or ignored, but something that had to be confronted and embraced. Through these rituals, ancient cultures did not just seek to conquer death. They sought to understand it, to tame it, and to make peace with it. In ancient Egypt, death was not an end, but rather the beginning of an epic journey. The Egyptians believed that life continued after death, but it was a journey that required careful preparation, not just for the body but for the soul as well. The grand tombs, the mummification process, and the vast riches entombed with the deceased were all part of an elaborate ritual designed to ensure a safe passage to the afterlife. The idea that the soul would travel through treacherous landscapes to reach its final resting place was at the heart of Egyptian burial practices. The pyramids themselves, monumental structures that reached toward the heavens, were built as eternal homes for the pharaohs, where they could be protected for all eternity. These tombs were more than just final resting places. They were gateways to another world, designed to safeguard the deceased from the perils of the afterlife. But what exactly did these grand tombs reveal about the Egyptian view of death? They were not simply markers of wealth and status. They were intricate, sacred spaces that symbolized the Egyptian understanding of death as a journey, fraught with danger, but also filled with promise. Mummification, which preserved the body for the afterlife, was an essential part of this process. The Egyptians believed that if the body was not properly preserved, the soul would be unable to recognize it and would lose its way in the afterlife. To ensure that the soul remained intact, they embalmed the body, removed the organs and wrapped it in linen, turning it into a mummy. This process was meant to preserve not only the physical body but also the essence of the person, allowing the soul to continue its journey into the afterlife. As part of this sacred ritual, the tombs of pharaohs were filled with everything they would need for the long journey ahead: treasures, food, and even servants. The Egyptians believed that the afterlife mirrored the physical world, so the deceased would need these items for survival. Riches were buried with the pharaohs to provide comfort in the next world, but they also served as a symbol of the pharaoh's power and the belief that their rule continued beyond death. In addition to material possessions, the tombs often contained elaborate murals and inscriptions that depicted scenes from the deceased's life and their journey through the afterlife. These paintings and texts were meant to guide the soul, offering protection and ensuring that the deceased would have everything they needed to navigate the dangers they would face in the underworld. The tombs of Egypt, particularly the Grand Pyramids, were a reflection of how the ancient Egyptians viewed death as both a profound mystery and a continuing journey. They were a way to offer comfort to the living, by providing a sense of order and control over something that could not be controlled. The rituals surrounding burial in ancient Egypt revealed a deep-seated belief that death was not to be feared, but faced with preparation, respect, and reverence. The journey to the afterlife, though fraught with peril, was ultimately an opportunity for rebirth and eternal peace. Through their grand tombs and burial rituals, the Egyptians demonstrated their understanding of death as a passage, a transition that required not only physical readiness but spiritual fortitude. This belief in an afterlife shaped not only their funerary practices but their entire worldview. Are you fascinated by how ancient burial rituals reflect our fear of death? Subscribe now to explore more shocking truths about history's darkest mysteries. Don't miss out on uncovering the secrets of the past. Hit the notification bell. In ancient Mesopotamia, death was not seen as an end, but rather a passage to another realm, and it was one that needed to be traversed with the right resources. The Mesopotamians believed that the afterlife, much like life, required preparation, and that the dead should be provided with everything they might need to sustain themselves in their journey through the underworld. It was not unusual for the dead to be buried with treasures, precious metals, food, and even animals. These burials were not merely for the rich and powerful. In fact, many ordinary people were also laid to rest with objects that would make their journey easier. The treasures buried with the dead weren't only for practical purposes, however. They also served as symbolic tokens meant to appease the gods, ensuring that the deceased would have protection and a place in the afterlife. This belief was reflected in the remarkable burial practices of the Sumerians and later the Babylonians. For the Sumerians, the belief in the afterlife was closely tied to the gods of the underworld. The journey to the afterlife was fraught with dangers, and those who were unprepared were said to suffer. To protect the dead from the terrors of this journey, treasures were often buried alongside them, ensuring they had the means to navigate the dark and dangerous realms beyond. It was not just physical wealth that was buried with the dead, but items that were believed to hold magical power, offering spiritual protection as the deceased passed into the afterlife. The most famous example of this is the tomb of Queen Pwabi, one of the most impressive burial sites discovered in the ancient city of Ur. Here, the queen's tomb contained not only elaborate jewellery, such as gold diadems and lapis lazuli necklaces, but also ceremonial items like drinking vessels and musical instruments. These objects weren't just for the queen's enjoyment in the afterlife. They were offerings to the gods and tools for navigating the afterlife's trials. Alongside the queen were the remains of attendants, who were believed to accompany her on her journey, symbolising the belief that those in the service of the dead would continue to serve even in the afterlife. In Mesopotamia, burials were deeply connected to the culture's views on death and the afterlife. Death was not an isolated event. It was part of a cosmic order in which the gods played an active role. The rituals surrounding the dead reflected this belief. Not only was the deceased carefully embalmed and prepared for the afterlife, but everything surrounding their death, be it the physical objects or the ceremonies, was meant to ensure that they would make it safely through their journey. For the Mesopotamians, treasure burials were about much more than wealth. They were a way of ensuring that the deceased would not be left wanting in the afterlife. It was an attempt to control the unpredictable and in doing so ease the fear of death. Just as the Egyptians used their grand tombs and rituals to ensure the smooth passage of their pharaohs, the Mesopotamians used their treasure burials to equip the dead for the challenges that lay ahead. These practices show a deep-rooted cultural understanding of death as something that requires preparation, reverence, and respect. They also reflect humanity's universal desire to ease the fear of death by offering security to the soul and showing that even in death, no one should go unprepared. In the ancient Mayan civilization, death was not a mere passage into a peaceful afterlife, but a perilous journey through the underworld, known as Xibalba. This dark and treacherous realm, ruled by powerful gods, was a place where only the strongest souls could navigate to reach their final rest. For the Mayans, death was not an end. It was a test, a trial of strength, endurance, and wit. Burial rituals in Mayan culture reflected this belief in the afterlife as a difficult, trial-filled journey. The souls of the dead were thought to face various challenges and obstacles in Xibalba, many of which required them to demonstrate bravery and intelligence. The afterlife was not a restful place for the faint of heart. It was a harsh and testing environment where the dead would have to prove their worthiness. To prepare for this journey, the Mayans believed that certain burial practices could assist the deceased in surviving the trials of the underworld. The burial offerings placed with the dead, such as tools, weapons, and food, were meant to prepare them for the challenges they would face in Xibalba. However, it wasn't just about material wealth. The Mayans also buried their dead with symbolic items like incense, jade, and intricately carved figurines that were believed to have spiritual significance, providing protection and guidance as the soul navigated through the dark realms. Many of the tombs and burial sites discovered in the Mayan world contain elaborate artifacts and ceremonial objects that were intended to equip the deceased for their arduous journey. It was believed that the soul would encounter a series of trials, many of which mirrored the physical challenges and suffering that the living endured. The rituals surrounding Mayan death were deeply rooted in their understanding of the cosmos and the forces that governed life and death. The Mayan underworld, Xibalba, was a place where spirits faced trials that tested their resolve. These trials, based on the belief that death was a continuation of life struggles, were seen as a test of moral and physical strength. In their burial practices, the Mayans emphasized the importance of the deceased's ability to face death's trials head-on. Notably, the most significant artifact found in many Mayan tombs is the jade burial mask. This mask, often placed over the deceased's face, symbolized the transformation of the individual from the world of the living to the world of the dead. It was believed to represent the deceased's face when they arrived in the afterlife, allowing them to see and survive the test of Xibalba. But the Mayans didn't just prepare for the afterlife in their burial practices. They believed in the continuous connection between life and death. The deceased were not left alone in their struggle. Their living family members would often perform rituals to help their loved ones pass the tests of the underworld. These practices served not only to aid the dead in their journey, but also to ease the living's fear of the unknown. Through these complex burial customs, the Mayans recognized that death was not to be feared, but understood as a difficult, inevitable journey that required strength, guidance, and preparation. The Mayan underworld wasn't merely a place where the soul rested. It was a space that demanded the deceased's bravery and resilience. Their elaborate burial rituals and symbolic artifacts revealed a profound understanding of death as a journey filled with challenges, one that required not just physical preparedness but spiritual endurance. This focus on strength, courage, and the trials of the afterlife is a reminder that, for the Mayans, death wasn't an end. It was simply another chapter in the cosmic struggle between life and death, where only the strongest souls could triumph. In ancient Celtic culture, death was not seen as a definitive end, but as a passage to another world. The other world, a mystical realm where the spirits of the dead would continue their existence in a different form. The Celts believed that life and death were part of a cyclical process, and that the souls of the deceased would travel to this other world, which was often depicted as a place of eternal youth, beauty, and abundance. The rituals surrounding death and burial were of paramount importance, as the Celts believed that improper burial could leave the soul lost and wandering, unable to find peace in the afterlife. One of the most prominent burial practices of the Celts was the use of burial mounds. These mounds were carefully constructed burial sites, often topped with stone cairns or other markers, and were seen as gateways to the other world. The mounds themselves were believed to hold a mystical power, a connection between the living world and the world of the dead. The entrance to these mounds or tombs was often aligned with the movement of the stars or other celestial bodies, further symbolizing the connection between the earth and the cosmos, life and death. The act of burial within these mounds was not simply about placing the dead beneath the earth. It was an act of sending the deceased on a journey to another realm, one where they could be reborn or continue to play a role in the ongoing cycle of life. Burial mounds, like those found in Ireland, Scotland and Wales, were often massive structures, designed to accommodate multiple individuals and to serve as communal spaces for the dead. They were frequently constructed with intricate stonework, carvings, and other symbols that held deep spiritual significance. These tombs were not only meant to house the dead, but were also seen as places where the living could commune with their ancestors, honouring them and seeking guidance from their spirits. For the Celts, the dead were never truly gone. They lived on in the other world, and through the rituals of burial, the living could maintain a connection with their departed loved ones. This connection was vital, as the Celts believed that the spirits of their ancestors could offer protection, wisdom, and blessings to the living. In fact, the construction of burial mounds was often accompanied by feasts, sacrifices, and other rituals to ensure that the deceased were properly cared for in the afterlife. These rituals not only served to honour the dead, but also to ensure that the cycle of life, death, and rebirth continued uninterrupted. The use of burial mounds also had a practical aspect. The Celts believed that these structures, with their hidden chambers and sacred sites, could serve as places of protection for the community. Some burial mounds were used as strongholds in times of war, offering refuge for the living while maintaining the connection to the dead. These sacred spaces, where the living and the dead coexisted, reflected the Celts' deep respect for death as a natural and integral part of life. The burial mounds were symbolic of the cyclical nature of existence, where the boundaries between life and death were not as rigid as they might seem. The dead were not feared. Instead, they were honoured as part of the ongoing cycle of existence, a cycle that would continue as long as the living remembered them. Through these burial practices, the Celts demonstrated their belief in an eternal connection between the living and the dead, a connection that transcended the physical world and bridged the gap between the earthly realm and the divine. The burial mounds were not only the final, resting place for the dead, but were also powerful symbols of the Celts' view of death as a transition to a world where the dead were never truly gone, but instead continued to live on in the hearts and minds of the living. In ancient China, death was often viewed not as an end, but as a transition into another realm where protection and guidance were essential for the soul's journey. This belief is most famously exemplified in the Terracotta Army, a collection of thousands of life-sized clay soldiers buried with Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, in the 3rd century BCE. The emperor, who sought to conquer death itself, had these soldiers crafted to accompany and protect him in the afterlife. This burial practice reflected the deeply held belief that death was not a final destination, but a journey that required guardianship, strength, and readiness to face whatever challenges lay ahead in the spirit world. The Terracotta Army was not merely a symbol of wealth and power, it was an extension of Qin Shi Huang's absolute control over life and death. The emperor, determined to preserve his rule beyond the grave, commanded the creation of over 8,000 soldiers, each uniquely crafted to resemble real-life warriors. The statues were placed in battle formations, facing east to protect the emperor's tomb from any malevolent forces that might attempt to disturb his eternal rest. For Qin Shi Huang, the afterlife mirrored the structures and rituals of life, and he needed an army to defend him just as he had during his reign. This practice was rooted in the ancient Chinese belief that the soul needed protection in the afterlife. It was a belief shared by many other cultures, but the scale and intricacy of the Terracotta Army make it one of the most impressive examples. The army, which includes not just soldiers but also horses, chariots and other servants, symbolized the emperor's desire to maintain power, control and protection even after death. But it was not only about military might. These statues were also meant to act as spiritual guardians. The Chinese believed that the afterlife was fraught with danger from evil spirits, demons, and other forces that could disrupt the soul's journey. By surrounding the emperor with a protective force of lifelike warriors, he could continue his reign from beyond the grave, safe from these dark forces. Each of the statues was painstakingly detailed, with distinctive facial features, clothing, and postures. This attention to detail was meant to ensure that the emperor would not only be protected but also recognized in the afterlife. The individuality of each soldier in the terracotta army reflected the emperor's belief that death was not a uniform experience. Each soul needed personal guardianship and a tailored path to peace. The construction of the terracotta army also served a more practical purpose, as it acted as a symbol of Qin Shi Huang's power and legacy. By surrounding himself with thousands of clay soldiers, he sought to immortalize himself and his empire. This was a man who conquered not only lands but time itself, ensuring that his presence would continue for eternity. The construction of the army took hundreds of thousands of workers, and the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, located in the ancient city of Xi'an, is still one of the most significant archaeological sites in the world. Though the emperor's rule was brief, his desire for immortality was not only symbolic, but also a physical manifestation of his belief in the afterlife as a space where power and protection were paramount. In this way, the terracotta army represents a powerful example of how death was perceived not as a finality but as an ongoing struggle, one that required preparedness and strength. The emperor's afterlife was a continuation of his reign, protected by warriors, horses, and servants, ensuring that his spirit remained unchallenged and his soul intact. The terracotta army stands as a testament to the belief that death is not to be feared, but faced with the same tenacity and protection that guided one through life. In the Viking world, death was not merely a passage to the afterlife, it was an event that required great respect and reverence, particularly for those who had led lives of valour and adventure. The Vikings, known for their mastery of the seas, believed that the afterlife was an extension of their earthly journeys, and for warriors, there was no greater tribute than to be sent off on a ship sailing into the next world. The practice of ship burials was not only a way to honour the dead, but also a belief that the soul's journey would continue across the waters to the afterlife, where the deceased could rest peacefully or continue their adventures in the realm of the gods. For these seafaring people, the sea was both a life-giver and a life-taker, and so it made sense to be buried in a vessel that had carried them through their most significant experiences. Ship burials were reserved for the highest of status, chieftains, warriors, and leaders who had shown extraordinary courage in battle or who had sailed far and wide. These burials were grand affairs, often involving the placement of the deceased in a ship, accompanied by offerings of treasure, weapons, and sometimes even animals or servants. The deceased would be laid on the ship's deck, surrounded by their belongings, as though preparing for a voyage. The ship, whether it was a large longship or a smaller vessel, was then set aflame, and the flames would consume both the ship and the body, sending the spirit of the deceased to the afterlife. The fire symbolized the release of the soul and the burning away of the earthly ties, allowing the deceased to embark on their journey to Valhalla or another afterlife realm, depending on the beliefs of the individual. The ship itself was a symbol of the journey, the connection between the living and the dead, and the Vikings' belief in an afterlife that continued on the open sea. Viking ship burials were more than just ceremonial, they were deeply spiritual and reflected the Vikings' intimate relationship with the ocean. The sea was their livelihood, their source of adventure, and the force that governed their fate. When a prominent warrior died, it was believed that they would sail one last time across the waters to a place of eternal rest, and it was this journey that Vikings sought to honour. These burials were often accompanied by elaborate rituals and sacrifices. Sometimes, animals would be placed on the ship, ensuring that the deceased had provisions for their journey. On occasion, slaves or servants were also buried alongside the dead to accompany them into the afterlife, fulfilling the role they had in life. The burning of the ship marked the end of the Vikings' physical existence, but the flames also symbolized the continuation of the journey, the transformation from one world to another, In some instances, Viking ship burials were placed in burial mounds or under large stones, further reinforcing the connection to the land and the sea. The combination of fire, ship, and sea reflected the Viking worldview. Death was not the end, but a continuation of the warrior's adventure. It was a transition into a new journey, one that would see them welcomed into the halls of the gods or sent to a world filled with endless seas. Ship burials, therefore, were not just about death. They were a reflection of the Vikings' views on life and the afterlife. By giving the dead a final voyage on the sea, they ensured that their spirits would forever be linked to the waters that had shaped their existence, a journey that would echo throughout eternity. In South American civilizations, death was not viewed as a finality, but as an essential part of a continuous spiritual journey. The dead were considered to be powerful entities, and their presence was believed to continue to influence the living. Many South American cultures, such as the Inca, Maya, and Nazca, placed great emphasis on ancestor worship, and their burial practices were intricately designed to maintain a connection with the departed. For these cultures, death was not an end, but a transition where the deceased played a critical role in the cosmic balance. The Andean peoples, especially the Inca, regarded their ancestors as guardians of the living, and it was through proper rituals that the living could ensure that the dead would continue to offer guidance, protection, and blessings. One of the most notable burial practices among the Incas was the mummification of the elite. These mummies were often placed in tombs, surrounded by objects and offerings that would allow them to live comfortably in the afterlife, and to remain active participants in the affairs of the living. The Inca rulers, known as Sapa Incas, were treated with great reverence even after death. Their mummified bodies were kept in grand tombs, often located in sacred places like mountaintops or within large stone structures. These tombs were not only places of rest for the deceased, but also served as sites for ritual performances, where living members of the community would honour their ancestors and seek their spiritual assistance. The mummified bodies of these rulers were believed to retain their power and influence, and ceremonies were conducted to maintain a bond between the living and the dead. Offerings of food, textiles, and other treasures were presented to the mummies to ensure their continued favour. Similar practices were seen in the Maya civilization, where burial rituals were conducted with a focus on maintaining a connection to the spiritual realm. The Maya believed that the soul of the deceased travelled to the underworld, and it was the responsibility of the living to guide them through this journey. Elaborate tombs were constructed for royalty, often filled with jade, ceramics, and other precious materials that were believed to aid the deceased in their afterlife. These burials were not only for the elite but also for commoners, who were sometimes buried in family tombs or simple graves with offerings to honour their connection to their ancestors. The concept of death was deeply intertwined with the idea of continuity in South American cultures, particularly with the belief that the dead would continue to watch over and guide the living. The Nazca people, known for their mysterious geoglyphs, also had burial practices that emphasized the role of ancestors. The Nazca buried their dead in tombs that were often adorned with vibrant textiles and other symbolic offerings. Like the Inca and Maya, the Nazca believed in the importance of ancestor worship as a way to ensure protection and blessings from those who had passed. Their tombs were designed as sacred spaces where the dead could remain connected to the living world. The practice of connecting with ancestors was not just about the dead, it was about ensuring that the living could thrive through the spiritual power passed down by those who had gone before. For these ancient cultures, death was a process of transformation, not an end. The burial rituals reflected a belief in an ongoing relationship between the living and the dead, a relationship that was maintained through respect, offerings, and ceremonies that allowed for guidance from the ancestors. South American burial practices were a reflection of this deep spiritual connection, ensuring that death was not feared, but understood as a continuation of the cycle of life, where the deceased continued to influence the living. Through these rituals, the living could keep their ancestors close and their spirits alive in the ongoing flow of time. In ancient Rome, death was viewed as both a solemn ritual and a necessary part of life's cycle, deeply embedded in their religious and social fabric. The Romans placed great emphasis on proper funerary practices, believing that how a person was buried influenced their peace in the afterlife and ensured that they could remain connected to the living. Funerals were major events, reflecting the social status and wealth of the deceased, and they were carried out with meticulous care and reverence. For the Romans, death was not something to be feared, but an inevitable transition that needed to be handled with the proper rites, ceremonies, and rituals to ensure the deceased's safe passage into the afterlife. The funerary practices of the Romans were tied to their belief in the cult of the dead, a spiritual practice that emphasized the importance of honoring ancestors and the deceased. The Romans believed that the spirits of their ancestors, known as the manes, were always present and could exert influence over the living. The dead were not seen as fully gone. Rather, their spirits continued to be active, capable of offering protection, guidance, or punishment. This belief in the presence of ancestral spirits gave rise to various rituals intended to appease the dead and keep them satisfied with their offerings. One of the most significant aspects of Roman funerary rites was the funeral procession. The procession would often involve family members and friends carrying the deceased body to the burial site, followed by a display of mourning and offerings. The Romans used elaborate funerary masks that were placed on the deceased's face to ensure that their spirit would be recognized in the afterlife. These masks were often carved in the likeness of the deceased, helping preserve their image for eternity. It was believed that proper recognition of the dead ensured that their soul could travel to the afterlife without becoming lost or vengeful. Burial sites were crucial in Roman death rituals. Romans typically buried their dead outside the city limits, often along the main roads leading into the city, creating necropolises that were both a means of honouring the dead and a symbol of the living's connection to them. The family tombs, often housed in elaborate mausoleums, were treated as sacred places where the deceased could be visited, offered food and wine, and remembered in an ongoing act of filial piety. These tombs also served as a constant reminder of mortality for the living. Roman tombs were richly adorned with inscriptions, sculptures, and frescoes that depicted the deceased's life, their achievements, and the legacy they left behind. These monuments were not just to honour the dead, but also to demonstrate the social standing and family heritage of those buried within. In addition to burial, cremation was also a common practice in ancient Rome, especially in the earlier periods. Cremation was seen as a means of releasing the soul from the physical body and sending it to the afterlife. The cremated remains would often be placed in urns and kept in family tombs, or placed in specially constructed columbaria, which were communal structures for holding cremation. Urns. Both burial and cremation reflected the Roman view that death was not an end but a transition, and that proper funerary rites were essential for the deceased to make this transition smoothly. Over time, the Romans integrated various foreign religious practices, such as the cult of Mithras and the worship of the Egyptian goddess Isis, into their own funerary customs. This syncretism reflected the Romans' belief that death and the afterlife were complex and multifaceted, requiring a blend of rituals to ensure a peaceful passage. The cult of the dead was not just a religious practice, but a societal necessity, woven into the fabric of Roman life. The dead were honoured not only through elaborate funerals, but through the continued remembrance of their names, deeds, and legacies. By paying homage to their ancestors, the Romans sought to maintain their connection with the past and ensure that their spirits would watch over the living, providing protection and guidance through the challenges of life. The Roman approach to death, while steeped in rituals and traditions, ultimately revealed a deep respect for the cycle of life and death, viewing death as a transition that was to be celebrated, honoured, and never feared. In ancient Greece, death was not only an inevitable part of life, but also a crucial step in the soul's journey, which demanded proper rituals and ceremonies. The Greeks believed that the soul was immortal, and that death was merely a transition from one realm to another, requiring the right guidance and rituals to ensure the soul's peaceful journey to the afterlife. However, the Greeks also feared the possibility of the soul wandering aimlessly, unable to find peace, which led to a highly structured system of funerary practices designed to ensure that the deceased's journey was both safe and meaningful. One of the most important rituals for the Greeks was the proper burial of the body. Without it, they believed the soul would be denied passage into the afterlife, causing it to become restless and unable to join the gods or find peace. In the days following death, the body was washed, anointed, and dressed, often in a simple garment to symbolize the soul's departure from the material world. A coin was placed on the deceased's mouth or eyes, which the Greeks believed was necessary to pay Sauron, the ferryman who would carry the soul across the river Styx to the underworld. This act reflected the Greeks' belief in the importance of financial offerings for the afterlife, ensuring that the soul would have the means to journey to its final resting place. The funeral itself was a significant event, involving a procession to the burial site, where mourners would carry the body and offer prayers to the gods. Friends and family of the deceased would express their grief through rituals of wailing and lamentation, allowing their sorrow to be an expression of respect for the deceased's transition. This mournful act also served as a reminder for the living of the inevitability of death, reinforcing the Greek view that death was a natural part of the human experience. Upon reaching the burial site, the body was either cremated or buried in a grave, depending on the time period and the social status of the deceased. The Greeks practiced both burial and cremation, with the preference for one over the other changing throughout the centuries. If the body was buried, a simple mound was often constructed, marking the final resting place of the deceased. If the deceased was cremated, the ashes were collected in an urn and often placed in a tomb or family grave. After the burial or cremation, the Greeks would perform a series of rituals to ensure the safe passage of the soul. A final feast was often held in honour of the deceased, where the living would offer food and drink to the spirit, asking for its protection and guidance. This was also a time for the family to reflect on the deceased's life and legacy, ensuring that their memory lived on in the hearts and minds of those who survived them. The Greeks believed that the dead could continue to influence the living world, and so they made sure that the deceased were treated with the utmost respect, offering prayers and sacrifices to keep the soul satisfied. They believed that the spirits of the dead could act as intermediaries between the living and the gods, guiding them in times of need or crisis. Thus, the funerary rituals in ancient Greece were not just about honouring the dead, but also about ensuring that their spirits were ready to embark on the journey to the afterlife. The Greeks believed that the soul's journey continued even after death, and it was through the rituals and offerings made by the living that the deceased could find peace and solace in the underworld. The rituals ensured that the deceased would be welcomed into the afterlife by the gods and spirits of the underworld, where they would take their place among the immortals. In many ancient civilizations, burial practices were not only a reflection of cultural beliefs about death and the afterlife, but also a clear marker of social class. The way individuals were buried revealed much about their status in society, as the common people often had far simpler, more modest burial rites compared to the elite. While kings, nobles, and high-ranking officials were buried with elaborate tombs, vast treasures, and complex rituals, the common people's burials were often far more humble, yet they still held significant meaning within the society's spiritual framework. In ancient Egypt, for instance, the burial practices of the pharaohs, with their grand pyramids and treasure-filled tombs, were in stark contrast to the simple graves of the lower classes. Pharaohs were mummified, their tombs filled with items meant to ensure a safe passage into the afterlife. Meanwhile, the common people, though also believing in an afterlife, were buried in less elaborate ways. Their tombs, while often unmarked or modestly adorned, still featured offerings such as bread, pottery, and simple items that were thought to help them on their journey after death. These simpler burials reflected the belief that death was a great equalizer, yet the living still maintained a sense of respect and reverence for the dead, regardless of social standing. Similarly, in ancient Greece and Rome, the elite were given grand funerals, with marble monuments, inscriptions and detailed tombs to celebrate their legacy. These tombs served not only as a resting place for the body, but as a symbol of the individual's importance and their continued influence in the afterlife. In contrast, the common people's burials were far less ornate, though still meaningful. They might be buried in simple graves, often with a small stone marker or a modest inscription. But these graves still reflected the culture's deep respect for the dead. Funerary offerings in these common graves were typically simple, small tokens or food offerings to ensure that the soul could continue its journey. The absence of elaborate markers for common people did not reflect a lack of respect, but rather an acknowledgement of the fact that death was a universal experience. The burial practices for the lower classes demonstrated that, regardless of wealth, all souls were believed to undergo the same journey, one that required at least some ritual recognition. In some societies, such as in ancient Mesopotamia, there was a similar distinction between the elite and commoners in terms of burial practices. The rich were buried with treasures, food, and attendants to accompany them in the afterlife, while the commoners were often interred in simple pit graves. However, even the most modest graves were often marked with symbols or offerings that demonstrated a belief in the soul's continuing journey. In ancient China, the belief in ancestor worship was central to both elite and commoner burials. While the emperors and high-ranking officials were buried with elaborate rituals and precious goods, even the common people practiced ancestor veneration, placing simple items such as food, clay figurines, and other tokens in the graves of their loved ones. These practices reflected a belief that the dead, regardless of their social status, were still vital to the well-being of the living, and it was important to maintain a connection with them. The distinction between the elite and common people's burials also reflected a broader social structure, and the role that death played in reinforcing societal hierarchies. While the rich could afford more elaborate burials and the common people made do with simpler rites, the rituals surrounding death were universally important. Burial practices for the common people not only showcased the basic human need to respect and honour the dead, but also revealed how even in death, society's class divisions were reflected. Despite these differences, all burial rituals shared a common belief in the importance of the afterlife and the spiritual journey of the soul. Burial practices, whether for the elite or the common people, served as a powerful reminder that death, in all its simplicity or grandeur, was an inevitable part of life and a universal experience that transcended wealth and status. In many ancient cultures, death was not merely the end of an individual's life, but the beginning of an ongoing relationship between the living and the dead, often through the practice of ancestor worship. Ancestor worship was the belief that the spirits of deceased family members continue to have an active role in the lives of their descendants, guiding, protecting, and sometimes even punishing them. This belief played a significant role in the funerary practices of many ancient civilizations, including those of China, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. Ancestor worship was seen as a way to honor the dead and maintain a connection with them, ensuring their continued influence over the living world. In ancient China, ancestor worship was deeply ingrained in society, with elaborate funeral rituals designed to ensure that the deceased were properly honored. The belief that ancestors remained an active part of the family's life was so strong that families would conduct regular rituals to maintain their favor. These rituals often included offerings of food, incense, and other items, which were believed to sustain the spirits of the ancestors and ensure that they would continue to bless the living with protection, good fortune, and guidance. The Chinese also placed great emphasis on the proper burial of the deceased, as they believed that an improper burial would result in the spirit being unable to find peace or properly watch over the family. In ancient Egypt, ancestor worship was similarly significant, particularly in relation to the royal family. The Egyptians believed that the pharaohs were divine figures, and their continued influence after death was considered vital for the prosperity of the land. Temples and tombs were constructed to honour the pharaohs, and the living would regularly offer prayers and food to ensure that the deceased rulers would continue to guide the living. In addition to the pharaohs, common Egyptians also believed in the power of their ancestors to protect and guide them. Even though the burials for common people were less elaborate, their rituals still involved offerings and prayers to maintain the favour of their ancestors, ensuring that their spirits would watch over them and help them in times of need. In Mesopotamia, ancestor worship was practiced across multiple civilizations, including the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. The Mesopotamians believed that their ancestors were not only part of their spiritual lives but also had an active role in maintaining the balance between the living and the divine. Rituals were often performed at family tombs, where offerings of food and drink were made to the spirits of the deceased. The living would also make petitions to their ancestors for protection and blessings, asking for guidance in times of war, famine, or illness. These rituals were conducted with great respect, as it was believed that failing to honour the ancestors properly could bring misfortune or disaster to the family. In both Egypt and Mesopotamia, the practice of ancestor worship also extended to the idea of the dead being part of the divine realm, where they could act as intermediaries between the gods and the living. Ancestors were seen as powerful spiritual beings who could influence the fortunes of their descendants, making their worship an essential part of daily life. The importance of ancestor worship in funerary practices was not just about ensuring protection from the dead, but also about maintaining the continuity of the family and the community. In many cultures, ancestors were believed to have the power to help their descendants navigate the complexities of life, and it was through proper rituals that this spiritual bond could be maintained. The continued veneration of ancestors, through offerings and ceremonies, allowed families to keep a connection to their past and honour the legacy of those who came before them. Ancestor worship helped solidify the belief that death was not an end, but a transition into a continued relationship with the past, a relationship that was integral to the spiritual and social order of many ancient societies. Death, despite being an inevitable part of the human experience, brings with it profound psychological turmoil. The grief and sorrow felt by the living are not just emotional reactions, but also the manifestation of a deep fear of loss and the unknown. This fear, which is both personal and collective, has spurred the development of numerous death rituals across different cultures. These rituals, however, do not only serve the spiritual needs of the deceased, they play a crucial role in providing psychological comfort for the living. Death rituals offer a sense of order and control over something that is inherently uncontrollable, our mortality. For the grieving family and friends, these rites offer a structure in which their emotions can be processed and their grief acknowledged, without feeling overwhelmed by the chaos and finality of death. Across cultures, the act of performing funeral rites provides a safe space to express sorrow, release tension, and find closure. The ancient Egyptians, for example, saw death as a transition from one realm to another, and their burial rituals helped maintain a connection between the living and the dead. These rituals provided psychological comfort by ensuring that the deceased were properly cared for, thus allowing the living to move through their own grief, knowing that their loved ones were not lost forever. The elaborate mummification process, burial in grand tombs, and offerings of goods to sustain the deceased were not merely ceremonial. They offered a way for the living to deal with the emotional weight of loss. They also allowed the living to engage in a meaningful act, one that would bring closure and help them manage the fear of the unknown. Similarly, in ancient Greece and Rome, funeral rituals were not only seen as a necessary way to honour the deceased, but also as a means for the living to cope with their loss. The Greeks held belief in the soul's journey, but they also recognized that mourning was a crucial part of the process for the living. In the ancient world, funerary rituals often involved public ceremonies, funeral processions, feasts and offerings, allowing the community to come together and share in the collective grief. These practices not only helped provide a sense of closure, but also created a sense of solidarity among the mourners, as they could unite in the shared human experience of loss. The Romans, with their complex funerary rites, believed that it was necessary to honour the dead to avoid the wrath of their spirits. But these rituals also helped the living by offering them psychological comfort and solace. The act of placing the deceased in a tomb, accompanied by offerings and prayers, was seen as a way to ensure that the soul would have peace, and by doing so, the living could begin to heal. In many ways, rituals surrounding death are not only about appeasing the dead or ensuring their passage to the afterlife, they are deeply for the living. They provide a structure that helps mourners make sense of an otherwise senseless event. For instance, in cultures where ancestor worship is practiced, like in ancient China, the living would regularly perform rituals to honour their ancestors, ensuring that their spirits remained benevolent and offered guidance. The psychological comfort for the living came not only from honouring the deceased, but from reinforcing the belief that their loved ones were still present, albeit in a different form. The rituals allowed the living to channel their emotions in a meaningful way, creating a bridge between the present and the past, and reaffirming the continuity of relationships even beyond death. While death may be the end of life, it is also an ongoing process of emotional and psychological adjustment for those left behind. Death rituals provide a framework for that adjustment, helping people confront their fear of the unknown, while allowing them to grieve, process, and eventually accept the loss. By offering structure, purpose, and a sense of continuity, these rituals provide the psychological comfort needed for the living to heal and move forward. The fear of death and what lies beyond has been a central theme in human cultures throughout history. One of the greatest anxieties surrounding death is the fear of the unknown, specifically the fear of malevolent forces and evil spirits that could harm the living or disturb the peace of the deceased. Many ancient cultures believed that spirits, particularly those of the dead, could return to the physical world and cause harm to the living if they were not properly appeased or kept at bay. To address this fear, a variety of rituals were created, designed not only to protect the living, but to ensure that the deceased could make their way to the afterlife without lingering in the world of the living. The fear of evil spirits and restless souls was particularly prevalent in ancient Egypt, where elaborate burial practices were designed to ward off malevolent entities. Egyptians believed that once a person died, their soul would embark on a perilous journey through the underworld, which was filled with dangers, demons, and obstacles. To protect the soul and ensure it could pass through the underworld unscathed, Egyptians placed numerous protective charms and amulets in the tombs of the deceased. These charms were designed to ward off evil spirits and guide the soul safely to the afterlife. The use of protective spells, inscribed on the walls of tombs and magical symbols, was common, reflecting the belief that the dead could encounter malevolent beings during their journey. In ancient Greece, the fear of restless spirits and evil entities was also prevalent. It was believed that the souls of the dead could return to the living world and cause havoc if they were not properly respected or appeased. To prevent this, the Greeks performed various rituals designed to protect both the living and the deceased. They would leave offerings at tombs, such as food, drink, and flowers, in hopes of keeping the spirits of the dead content, and ensuring that they would not return to cause harm. In some cases, the Greeks would even perform rituals to send the souls of the dead to the underworld, including offerings to Hecate, the goddess associated with ghosts and the night, to keep spirits from haunting the living. The Romans shared similar beliefs about the restless dead and evil spirits. Like the Greeks, the Romans performed elaborate funeral rites and placed offerings at the graves of the deceased to keep their spirits appeased. Roman families would place small tokens of food and drink near tombs to prevent spirits from returning to the living world. It was also common to place protective symbols, such as the bulla, an amulet worn by children to ward off evil, on the deceased to ensure their peace in the afterlife. The practice of ancestor worship also played a role in this belief. The Romans believed that their ancestors continued to watch over them and that maintaining proper rituals and offerings was necessary to keep the spirits of the dead from turning malevolent. In ancient China, similar fears of malevolent spirits and restless ancestors led to the development of elaborate rituals designed to protect the living and honor the dead. The Chinese believed that the souls of the dead could wander the earth and bring misfortune if they were not properly cared for. To prevent this, they would make offerings of food, money, and incense at tombs, and in some cases they would burn effigies of servants or animals to ensure that the spirit of the deceased had everything they needed for the afterlife. These rituals were also thought to protect the living from evil spirits that might otherwise cause harm. Many cultures also believed in the power of specific objects, such as charms, statues, or sacred relics, to ward off evil spirits. These objects were often placed in graves or worn by the living as protective talismans. In some cases, families would bury the deceased with objects meant to confuse or trap spirits, ensuring that they would not return to the physical world. The rituals surrounding the dead were designed not only to honor and guide the deceased, but also to protect the living from the powerful and often feared forces that existed beyond the realm of the living. By performing these rituals and offering up sacrifices, ancient cultures sought to create a balance between the worlds of the living and the dead, ensuring that the spirits of the dead would find peace and that the living would be protected from harm. The practice of offering gifts to the gods or deceased ancestors is as old as human civilization, and it raises an important question. Are these offerings acts of piety, or are they more about securing peace, favor, or protection? Across various ancient cultures, offerings were made with great care, and the items presented could range from food and drink to treasure and slaves. But why did ancient people feel the need to provide gifts to the gods or the dead? One of the primary reasons for offering gifts was the belief that the gods and spirits had the power to either bless or curse the living. In many cultures, the gods were seen as unpredictable and powerful forces that could bring about both prosperity and destruction. In this context, offerings could be seen as a form of appeasement, a way to prevent misfortune or to attract the favor of divine powers. The ancient Greeks, for example, were known for their offerings of food, wine, and incense to their gods, particularly during rituals and festivals. These offerings were not seen merely as gifts, but as a way to maintain a positive relationship with the gods. They believed that by providing offerings, they could ensure that the gods would continue to bless them with good harvests, protection in battle, and overall prosperity. In this sense, the offerings could be interpreted as a form of bribery, a way of bargaining for divine favor in exchange for sustenance and respect. Similarly, in ancient Mesopotamia, offerings were made to both gods and spirits to ensure peace and prevent disaster. The Mesopotamians believed that their gods controlled various aspects of their lives such as weather, agriculture, and fertility. As a result, they made offerings to ensure that the gods would be pleased and that the community would thrive. Temples were often filled with offerings such as food, livestock, and precious goods meant to keep the gods content and in return keep the forces of chaos at bay. But offerings were not just about appeasing the gods. They were also a way to honor the dead and maintain a spiritual connection with the ancestors. In many cultures, it was believed that the deceased continued to watch over the living and that proper offerings would ensure their favor. The ancient Egyptians, for example, placed food, wine, and other goods in the tombs of the deceased, believing that these items would help the deceased in their journey through the afterlife. These offerings were seen as necessary to ensure that the dead were not restless, and that they could continue to provide guidance and protection from the other side. The ancient Chinese similarly believed that offerings made to their ancestors could ensure their protection and help bring good fortune to the family. Food, incense, and even money were offered at ancestral shrines and graves, with the belief that the spirits of the ancestors could continue to intervene in the lives of their descendants. While these offerings may have been seen as a way to honor and remember the dead, they also functioned as a means of securing the peace and protection of the ancestors, ensuring that they would continue to watch over and bless the family. In many ways, offerings were a form of psychological security. The act of making an offering provided the living with a sense of control over forces that were otherwise beyond their understanding. By presenting offerings, individuals could feel they were doing their part to secure divine favour, protection, and prosperity, while simultaneously maintaining their spiritual connection with the gods and the dead. In this sense, offerings were less about the value of the gifts themselves and more about the emotional and psychological benefits they provided to the living. Whether through appeasing the gods or honouring the dead, the act of offering was a way to create balance and harmony in a world that was often unpredictable and dangerous. These rituals allowed individuals and communities to navigate the uncertainty of life and death, and they became a fundamental part of the human experience. Death masks have been an integral part of funerary practices across numerous ancient civilizations, serving both symbolic and practical purposes in the preparation of the deceased for their journey into the afterlife. These masks were often made of materials such as gold, bronze, clay, or even stone, designed to replicate the face of the deceased with extraordinary detail. But what made these masks so significant wasn't merely the artistry behind them. It was their deep connection to the spiritual belief surrounding death and the afterlife. Death masks were believed to preserve the soul of the deceased and ensure that their spirit would be properly recognized in the afterlife. For the ancient Egyptians, the death mask was an essential part of the mummification process. The famous golden death mask of Pharaoh Tutankhamun is perhaps the most well-known example, symbolizing both the divine status of the pharaoh and his immortality. The mask, which depicts the pharaoh's likeness with incredible realism, was placed over his mummified face to help his soul recognize its physical form after death. This was important because the Egyptians believed that if the soul couldn't recognize the body, it would become lost or trapped, unable to proceed into the afterlife. The mask served as a bridge between the living and the dead, providing a permanent likeness of the deceased that would endure for eternity. But it wasn't just about recognizing the deceased. The death mask was also symbolic of the deceased's journey into the realm of the gods. It was believed to offer protection and help the deceased face the challenges of the afterlife. In Egypt, the deceased were thought to encounter various gods and spirits during their journey through the underworld, and the mask would ensure that they were not only recognized but also granted favor. The intricate designs, often embellished with precious materials like lapis lazuli and gold, symbolized divine authority and a sacred connection to the gods, emphasizing the eternal nature of the pharaoh's reign, even beyond death. Similarly, in ancient Rome, death masks were used as a way of preserving the memory and status of the deceased, particularly for prominent individuals like emperors and aristocrats. Roman funerary practices involved creating masks of notable ancestors, which were displayed in the home during ceremonies and passed down through generations. These masks, known as imagines, were meant to honour the dead and keep their memory alive, reinforcing the family's legacy and social status. Much like the Egyptians, the Romans believed that maintaining a visible connection to their ancestors was essential for both spiritual protection and social cohesion. In other parts of the world, such as in Africa and Mesoamerica, death masks also held significant spiritual and symbolic importance. In many African cultures, masks were used in burial rituals to protect the soul of the deceased and ensure a successful passage into the afterlife. These masks were often carved with intricate designs, reflecting the spirit world's complex symbolism, and were believed to possess the power to ward off evil spirits or guide the deceased soul. The masks also served as a way for the living to engage with the spirits, honouring their ancestors while ensuring that the soul could peacefully make its journey to the next realm. In Mesoamerica, particularly among the Maya and Aztec cultures, death masks were also used to ensure that the deceased soul would be recognized and protected. For the Maya, these masks were crafted from jade, which was considered to be a symbol of life and immortality, symbolizing the deceased's passage from one realm to another. These masks were placed over the face of the deceased, much like in Egypt, to ensure that the spirit would not be lost and would receive protection from evil forces during the dangerous journey to the afterlife. The role of death masks in these cultures was not simply about preserving the likeness of the dead. It was about providing a spiritual safeguard, ensuring that the dead would not be forgotten and that they would continue to have influence over the living. Whether for recognition, protection, or spiritual continuity, death masks served as a tangible connection between the living and the dead, embodying the belief surrounding immortality, the afterlife, and the need to honour those who had passed. They allowed the living to confront the unknown with a sense of order and control, providing psychological comfort while preserving the legacy of the deceased. The psychology of fear in ancient times was deeply intertwined with the unknown, the mysterious, and the supernatural. For ancient cultures, the fear of death and what lay beyond it was not just an existential concern, but a very real, psychological force that shaped their rituals, beliefs, and daily lives. Death, with all its unknowns, was seen as a mysterious and sometimes malevolent force, something that could not be fully understood or controlled. Ancient people feared not only the act of dying, but also the potential for suffering after death, whether from restless spirits, evil forces, or the consequences of improper burial. In a world that lacked the scientific understanding we have today, death was surrounded by a thick cloud of superstition and ritual, as humans sought to protect themselves from the unseen dangers lurking beyond the physical realm. For many ancient societies, death was the ultimate unknown, and its mysteries were often addressed through elaborate rituals meant to placate or control supernatural forces. In ancient Egypt, for example, the fear of death and the afterlife led to the development of elaborate burial customs designed to ensure that the deceased would successfully journey through the underworld and into the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul could encounter dangers in the afterlife, such as hostile gods or evil spirits, and that the proper rituals, mummification, protective amulets, and spells were necessary to protect the soul from these dangers. The intricate tombs and the presence of death masks were not just for physical preservation, but to psychologically reassure the living that the dead would not return as vengeful spirits or malevolent entities. The same fears that shaped Egyptian burial practices were evident in other cultures as well. The ancient Greeks, for example, believed in the idea of the soul's journey after death, but were also deeply fearful of wandering spirits who could cause harm to the living. To protect themselves from these restless souls, the Greeks made offerings to the dead and performed rituals designed to appease their ancestors and ensure that the spirits would be at rest. The Greeks also practiced the concept of the psychopomp, a guide for souls to the afterlife, believing that souls needed help in navigating the transition from life to death and beyond. This fear of wandering spirits was not limited to the Greeks and Egyptians. In ancient Rome, the dead were also seen as powerful and potentially dangerous. Romans believed that if the dead were not properly honoured, their spirits could return to seek revenge. This led to the practice of offering food, drink, and sacrifices to the deceased, along with the building of elaborate tombs and the display of ancestor masks to keep the spirits satisfied and prevent them from turning hostile. The Romans, like many ancient cultures, believed in the thin boundary between life and death, and the constant presence of the dead in their lives. Fear of death and the afterlife was not just a matter of belief. It was deeply psychological, influencing both personal and communal behaviour. In ancient Mesopotamia, the dead were believed to exist in a shadowy existence, neither fully alive nor truly dead. The fear of these spirits was pervasive, leading to the practice of providing offerings and placing charms in graves to ensure the deceased's peace and prevent them from causing harm. The living felt that they had to maintain a constant connection with the deceased to avoid the wrath of spirits, who could become angry if neglected. Even in more distant civilizations like the Maya and Aztecs of Mesoamerica, death was a deeply psychological experience, not just for the deceased but for the living as well. The fear of death was seen in the elaborate rituals meant to appease gods and spirits, ensuring that both the dead and the living could find peace. These cultures performed human sacrifices and created symbolic tombs, all to satisfy their fear of death's consequences. In each of these cultures, death was not simply an end, but a profound psychological and spiritual experience. The unknown aspects of death were feared because of the belief that the dead could return and disrupt the world of the living, causing illness, misfortune, or even death. The psychology of fear in ancient times thus led to rituals that sought not only to appease death, but to ensure that the soul could rest peacefully, preventing the living from suffering the consequences of an unsettled spirit. These deep fears shaped every aspect of their funerary practices and rituals, providing comfort to the living while maintaining order in a world governed by unknown forces. Burial rituals may seem like practices from the past, but they hold an enduring significance in the modern world, offering both psychological comfort and cultural meaning. Even as societies evolve and scientific understandings of life and death shift, the need for rituals surrounding death remains deeply embedded in human culture. These rituals provide structure during one of life's most chaotic and emotional moments. The way we care for the dead today, whether through funerals, memorial services, or cremation ceremonies, reveals just how much we still rely on tradition to process grief, honour the deceased, and navigate the emotional complexity of mortality. Despite our modern conveniences and advancements, death remains as mysterious and intimidating as it was in ancient times. The fear of the unknown is universal, transcending culture, time, and technology. Burial rituals are an important way to acknowledge this fear and give the living a sense of control and comfort in the face of loss. When someone dies, those left behind must come to terms with the finality of it all. Rituals serve as a crucial tool for this process, providing an emotional framework through which people can express their sorrow, say their goodbyes, and find meaning in the death of a loved one. For many, these rituals help create a sense of closure, offering a tangible way to honour the deceased and celebrate their life. The modern funeral, for example, is a ritual that, like its ancient counterparts, marks a significant transition. It offers a space for reflection, community support, and remembrance. People come together to mourn and to reaffirm the bonds of community, just as they did in ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. The emotional importance of these rituals cannot be overstated. They help those left behind find solace in the face of overwhelming grief, providing a communal environment for shared mourning. Furthermore, burial rituals are often connected to cultural and religious beliefs, which give them even greater meaning. Whether through the Christian belief in eternal life, the Buddhist view of reincarnation, or the Hindu tradition of cremation, death rituals offer a framework for making sense of what happens after life. These spiritual beliefs help those mourning find comfort in knowing that their loved one's journey does not end with death, offering peace to those struggling with the idea of final separation. Today, as in the past, burial practices are not solely about honouring the deceased, they're also about protecting the living. The ritual of a funeral or memorial is as much for those who remain behind as it is for the dead. It provides an opportunity to reflect on the deceased's life, their impact, and their legacy. Families and communities are able to mourn together, finding strength in one another and a shared sense of loss. In a world that often seems disconnected, death rituals bring people together, creating spaces for empathy, healing, and the continued honouring of a loved one's legacy. The way we treat our dead speaks volumes about our values, our beliefs, and our need for closure. Burial rituals help preserve the memory of the deceased, ensuring that they are not forgotten. In many ways, these rituals are our way of asserting that death does not erase the contributions a person made during their lifetime. Even in today's fast-paced digital world, the importance of burial rituals remains steadfast, providing a bridge between the living and the dead. Whether through traditional funerals, memorial services, or new practices like eco-friendly burials, these rituals continue to play a vital role in how we cope with the reality of death. They remind us that, even in an age of scientific understanding, the human need for emotional closure, spiritual connection, and remembrance remains a powerful and universal part of the human experience. Even in today's fast-paced technological world, the rituals surrounding death continue to have a profound impact on how we process loss, grieve, and honour those who have passed away. While science and reason may guide our understanding of the biological aspects of death, the emotional and spiritual dimensions of loss remain deeply influenced by practices established by ancient cultures. The fear of death, the unknown, and the belief in an afterlife shape the funerary rituals of civilizations long past, and these traditions still echo in our modern practices. From the elaborate burial rites of the ancient Egyptians to the simple but profound ceremonies of the ancient Greeks, the need for rituals to mark death and ensure a connection to the deceased has transcended time. Today, funeral practices, memorials, and remembrance rituals remain a vital part of our social and emotional fabric, providing a framework for the living to navigate grief and find closure. In many ways, modern funerals still mirror the ceremonies of ancient cultures as we seek to honour the dead and offer them protection, peace, and remembrance. Just as the Egyptians believed in the importance of guiding the soul through the afterlife, we too engage in practices that help the deceased spirit transition peacefully, offering comfort to the grieving. Whether through traditional funerals, cremation ceremonies, or other personalised rites, the core purpose of these rituals remains the same: to honour the deceased, provide emotional support for the living, and address our collective fears of death and the unknown. Even the concept of ancestor worship, prevalent in ancient cultures, has found modern parallels. Today, many cultures still emphasize the importance of remembering ancestors through family gatherings, annual memorials, and rituals that maintain a spiritual connection to those who came before us. These practices help to keep the deceased alive in memory, ensuring that their wisdom, values, and legacy continue to influence the living. For example, in many Eastern cultures, the act of honouring ancestors through offerings, prayers, and ceremonial events is still seen as a way of maintaining harmony between the living and the spirits of the departed. This cultural tradition emphasizes the importance of intergenerational bonds, where the past, present, and future are intricately connected through shared rituals. Another striking parallel between ancient rituals and modern practices is the use of symbolic objects in funerary rites. Just as the Egyptians placed amulets, statues, and protective symbols in the tombs of their dead to ensure their safety in the afterlife, modern funerals often incorporate items that carry deep personal meaning. These items may include photographs, keepsakes, or personal belongings that symbolize the life and legacy of the deceased. In this way, the emotional and symbolic significance of burial objects has remained remarkably consistent throughout history. The social aspect of death rituals also remains important in modern times. In ancient Greece, funerary processions were public events that brought people together to mourn and pay respect, much like modern-day memorial services and funerals. These ceremonies allow for collective grieving, offering a space where the community can unite in remembrance. Whether through intimate family gatherings or larger, more public ceremonies, death rituals serve as an important way for society to acknowledge loss and provide a collective outlet for grief. The psychological comfort that these rituals offer cannot be underestimated. The fear of death, both personal and collective, is alleviated through the shared experience of honouring the deceased and confronting mortality. Ancient rituals, though rooted in spiritual beliefs, helped people manage their anxiety about the unknown, and modern funeral practices continue to provide this same comfort. These rituals help individuals cope with the loss of loved ones, ensure a sense of closure, and give meaning to the experience of grief. While the specifics of death rituals may have evolved, the core emotional and psychological functions remain remarkably similar across time. Through these age-old practices, we are reminded that death, though inevitable, is not something to be feared in isolation. It is a shared experience, one that brings us together to honour the dead and, in doing so, find peace within ourselves. From Egypt to the Vikings, ancient burial rituals reveal much more than just the customs of the dead. They offer a glimpse into how humanity has always wrestled with the fear of death. These rituals provided both protection and comfort, ensuring a safe passage into the afterlife, but they also remind us of the universal fear of the unknown. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the ancient world, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and explore more fascinating insights into history's darkest secrets.